The podcast you're about to hear includes the story of a Katzie man named Slumach. Members of the Katzie First Nation have been instrumental in us telling this story properly. We acknowledge that the story of Slumach originates from the ancestral lands of the Katzie people. What you're about to hear, you may find graphic and violent in nature. Listener discretion is advised. A young woman arrived in Grand Forks looking for a Doc Brown. She was in an advanced stage of tuberculosis and was horribly thin, and doctors in Vancouver said her condition was incurable. Upon seeing her, Brown was reported to have said, quote, "Young woman, I'm not a doctor, but if you'll place yourself in my care and do what I tell you, I think I can cure you," end quote. The sick woman agreed and followed Brown to his place, where he had made her sleep outside in a tent, lie in the sun, and drink lots of his homemade wine, along with other herb remedies. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, a change took place. Days of wandering through the woodland, bathing in streams, and at last climbing the mountains allowed for color to return to the woman's cheeks. She began to gain weight as health returned to her body. The miracle had been performed. She went back to Vancouver a different woman with a deep and abiding sense of gratitude to Doc Brown. I'm Kru Williams, and this is Dead Man's Curse, Volcanic Gold. Episode 6, The Saga of Doc Brown. Volcanic Brown, Crazy Brown, Sunset Brown, Doc Brown. Those are all nicknames for Robert Allen Brown, each one alluding to a different era of his life. The story you just heard came from a newspaper article from the Grand Forks Gazette, titled simply, "The Story of a Colorful Old-Timer." And it gives us a glimpse at Robert Allen Brown during his Doc Brown years. And no, I don't mean Doc Brown from Back to the Future. We know the legend of Volcanic Brown, but during the first decades of the 20th century, he was also known in many circles and in the press as Doc Brown. Easy access to hospitals and healthcare simply didn't exist for most people, and you could die from simply stepping on a rusty nail. Life in the West was tough, so home remedies and natural medicines were the go-to for most injuries and illnesses. Brown had expert knowledge of plant medicines and knew his way around a forest. These skills not only helped him gain fame and even a little income as a naturopathic healer, more importantly, it led him on the treacherous path to Slumach's lost gold mine. Today, we'll share the details of that fateful meeting and dig into just how dangerous life in the wilds of British Columbia could be, especially for a prospector. Even a prospector as successful and skillful as Volcanic Brown. These stories may hold the key to the mystery behind his disappearance.
Volcanic Brown's movements on his trips, he would have medicines that it would be like today we would call them vitamins or supplements.
That's the wayshorer from our team, Don Froese. If you've been with us from the beginning of the podcast, you'll know that Don is a member of the Stolo First Nation. He's also a longtime student of plant and herbal medicines.
And then on the other hand, he would also carry with him the equivalent of a wilderness remote first aid kit, which would consider of medicines, but these are specifically used for staying healthy.
There were no hospitals or clinics where Volcanic Brown would have been prospecting. He had spent most of his life in isolation while staking claims hundreds of miles from civilization. And even in towns and cities, healthcare in the late 1800s and early 1900s wasn't what it is today. Someone as resourceful as Volcanic Brown knew how to take care of himself in the wilderness, especially when life expectancy in the early 20th century was just 58 years old. Volcanic Brown was able to stay in good health into his 60s and 70s thanks to what Don Froese calls spring tonics.
When the trees are beginning to bud, he would have harvested the sap from a birch tree, and you drink that every day. And it's very high in vitamins. It's one of the medicines that elders say that if you take it in spring, it builds up your immune system for the whole year. The other thing would have been nettles. It's like Indian spinach. That's another nickname for it. And then he would have dried them so he could carry them with him for tea for later on his trips. I'm looking at some of the ailments that stinging nettle treats, and probably like 40 different things. So as time goes on, he would be able to harvest everything from dandelions to miner's lettuce, fireweed shoots. The other big one is bulrushes or cattails, as they're known. The roots, the early shoots, the actual cob part of a bulrush is almost like corn on the cob when it's ready.
The forest can be like a buffet of nutrient-rich foods and remedies for those who know what to look for. This knowledge would have been attained through many years of travel and through many interactions. Although his fortune often required Brown to be a loner, Don says that in the Wild West, he would have relied on his neighbors for survival.
When we go into a new area, say when we're hunting, we go into a new area, we spend the first couple of days, and what we call it is getting to know our neighbors. And our neighbors are the trees, the fish, bears, the elk, the moose, the deer, not just the humans, but we're not even concerned about the humans as neighbors. We're concerned about everything else. Volcanic Brown went into these remote areas with a desire to get to know his neighbors, and his neighbors are the ones that kept him alive. And yeah, he engaged with human beings, but he engaged on a whole other dimension with Mother Earth, and that's what kept that guy going. That's what kept his motor running.
It's important to emphasize that for Volcanic Brown, this would have been his way of life. Going to the local pharmacy and getting over-the-counter medication wasn't an option. Don says that as much as Brown was serious about finding gold and treasure, he was serious about his health. Because let's face it, if you're not healthy, you're not wealthy. He had to be prepared, mentally and physically, and knowing the land helped him have the staying power to create a legacy. He was a settler from Eastern Canada. He traveled through the unforgiving terrain, known for claiming lives, before he set down roots in Grand Forks, BC. Don says he could have never done what he did had it not been for Brown's relationship with Indigenous people.
I think he embraced them. I think he had that was probably his saving grace in many instances, because they were the people that knew the area that he was going into. They were the people that had thousands of years of knowledge and wisdom as to how to safely live in those environments. And that's why Volcanic Brown survived as long as he did, is because he was a great listener. And he learned from those people, and that's what saved his ass. There's no doubt in my mind.
When Volcanic Brown settled in Grand Forks in the 1880s, he would have been in the region for several years when the tragic events of season 1 of this podcast occurred. We don't know for sure if Brown was aware of Slumach's manhunt, trial, and execution following the fatal shooting of Louis B. on September 8th, 1890. Considering how often Brown himself appeared in the newspapers at the time, it's very possible that he also saw the headlines and stories playing out in New Westminster, over 300 kilometers to the west. In 1891, the copper boom was in full force, and Volcanic Brown was busy staking Volcanic Mountain and planning Volcanic City. So, if he was reading the newspaper, he may have missed the drama surrounding Slumach's death. After all, gold didn't come into the story until 1915. Brian Antonson, co-author of the book Slumach's Gold in Search of a Legend, says that by the 1920s, the legend of Slumach's lost gold mine started to take shape, and prospectors from near and far were venturing deep into the pit after its hidden mother lode. By then, Volcanic Brown was one of them.
Seeking refuge from a storm one night, he spent some time with 4 businessmen from the town of Nelson who were on a hunting expedition. He told them that he had stumbled upon Slumach's granddaughter some years before as she lay near death on a trail. Well known for his prowess as an herbalist, he succeeded in saving her life. And as a reward, she told him the mine's secret location.
Whoa, let's stop right here for a moment. Slumach's granddaughter? Who is this granddaughter? And why would she tell Volcanic Brown, of all people, about the location of Slumach's secret gold mine, especially if it was cursed by her grandfather? Brian's book, Slumach's Gold, describes Brown's first recorded mention of how he caught wind of the mine. This information would have come from Slumach's actual lineage, not just random hearsay or prospector gossip.
Supposedly, his daughter lived on the Cowichan Reserve on Vancouver Island. Now then, theoretically, the granddaughter would have been there for some time. But then, there's a lot of mobility back in those days. We often think that this is ancient times. So there were steam units that went across what was called the Georgia Strait in those days, went back and forth between the island and the valley. So it could have been over there, or it could have been that she moved into the interior someplace before he actually made his way out here, launching to search for Slumach's lost gold.
We asked Brian if he knew when this happened, but he had questions of his own.
I don't know where this occurred, where they interacted. Was this on a previous trip when he was here in this area, or did he meet her somewhere else?
The Cowichan Reserve on Vancouver Island is a journey of over 600 kilometers by land and sea from Volcanic Brown's home in Grand Forks. It would be a huge coincidence for these paths to have crossed, either on Vancouver Island or in what we call the lower mainland of BC, the southernmost stretch of the province located near the US border east from Vancouver to the Rockies. The story Brian Antonson recounts is that Slumach's granddaughter was sick. But what if she were far away from home? She may have heard about Doc Brown's herbal remedies and turned to him for help.
Now, that is an interesting concept. What if she was away from the lower mainland and he ran into her at some time? She said, I know where some gold is. Thank you very much for curing me or healing me. And here's where some gold is. It's up near Pitt Lake. And my grandfather had found this years ago. So as a thank you, here's my payment. And then he encountered these guys at some time while he was traveling to this area and told them the story. But it's also nebulous because nobody knows for sure. As we know in the stories propagated by C.V. Tench and others, you can make this stuff up out of whole cloth. There could be absolutely no truth to it whatsoever.
It's true that we have no proof of whether Volcanic Brown ever met or healed Slumach's granddaughter. Regardless, wayshower Don Froese feels that an interaction between Volcanic Brown and Slumach's granddaughter is plausible.
He was like a family doctor of natural medicines. And I'm not sure how Slumach's granddaughter came in contact with him, but there wasn't that many people like Volcanic around. And even some of our own shaman, our own healers, our own doctors, there's different degrees of expertise, and not everybody knows the same information. So Volcanic Brown would have been probably top shelf when it came to medicine, and the word gets out. So, the word was out, and I think it's pretty interesting that she went to him, or he went to her, but no surprise.
We don't know what kind of illness would be so grave that Slumach's granddaughter offered up the location of the lost gold mine to Volcanic Brown as a thank you for saving her life. We also don't have any evidence of Volcanic Brown ever meeting, let alone curing Slumach's granddaughter with his famous herbal remedies. We only have third-hand reports in newspaper articles and books claiming Volcanic Brown learned about Slumach's mine because she told him. And when he went looking for it, he vanished. So, how did Volcanic Brown disappear in the mountains that were virtually his own backyard? Well, as we've discussed previously in the podcast, for any serious prospector on the trail for the Lost Creek gold mine, a key piece of information is the Jackson letter. You may remember that in the wake of Slumach's execution and before the legend of his lost gold mine and the curse solidified, a prospector by the name of Walter or John Jackson wrote a letter describing the location of the mine. Jackson supposedly gathered thousands of dollars worth of gold from this source, said to be worth billions, with nuggets the size of walnuts. He took as much as he could carry and buried still more under a tent-shaped rock. Of course, over the years, the letter has been copied and some details have been changed with each iteration. However, the language used in the letter and the understanding of the land indicate that it was written by someone who knew something. As we've said before, it's the basic treasure map that everyone in search of Slumach's gold mine has in their back pocket. According to Brian Antonson's book, Slumach's Gold, one copy of the letter survived among the items belonging to Volcanic Brown and was dated May 28, 1924, some 20 years after the letter was supposedly written. By the mid-1920s, Volcanic Brown was in his 70s and was known for his annual summer forays into the upper pit. In fact, he was so well known for his expeditions that he was often followed into the wilderness by less honorable prospectors.
He was always being followed.
That's Marc Ferrero, a former miner and historian who you've heard from in previous episodes.
He was followed all over British Columbia, but nobody could keep up to him. He was very, very good in the bush, a master bushman. Very, very good at eluding and losing his followers.
And sometimes those followers got him into serious trouble. In 1926, according to the book Slumach's Gold, Brown went in for his yearly quest and was followed by two other men. He watched their campfire smoke behind him for a few days, and when he didn't see it for 2 days in a row, he suspected something might have happened to them. Marc says Brown would have been worried because the terrain and conditions surrounding Pitt Lake are grueling, especially on the north end, where Brown would launch his expeditions every spring.
Can you imagine the Kootenays, minus 40 below in the wintertime, and colder at elevation, or at least that at elevation. And, out smashing around a pick hammer against a bunch of rock to make a hole in the wall. Okay, body heat, sweat, I get that. But still, you're not talking and hiking into these things. The north end of Pitt Lake, you can drive quite a ways, but it's remote. And in those years, almost completely isolated.
So when Brown noticed the absence of his followers' campfire smoke, he decided to turn back, and after a few days, found one of the men injured on the trail. His partner had left him to go look for help. At that moment, Brown decided to help the injured man back out to civilization rather than leave him there to wait. Once the man was safe, Brown returned to continue prospecting. But he was behind schedule, and he was late coming out of the mountains that year. Very late. By September of 1926, Volcanic Brown had not checked in as usual at the government fishery in the town of Alvin at the head of Pitt Lake. His absence was noticed, and around the second week of October, a search was mounted for the indomitable Volcanic Brown.
We've seen some really well-prepared, seasoned outdoorsmen, and, it just takes one slip and you're done.
That's Renee Coghill from the BC Search and Rescue Association. It's an all-volunteer organization. I repeat, all-volunteer group. And Renee is one of the incredible people that responds to emergencies when dispatched by the RCMP. They literally search for and rescue people in the wilderness throughout British Columbia.
You've broken an ankle and you're stuck and you're by yourself. And that's one thing is people that are usually really good in the forest, they feel more comfortable to go alone, right? And we never recommend really hiking alone for the exact reason is if something happens to you and you don't have a good check-in system or you don't have the opportunity or anyone to check in with, that could be pretty detrimental. But there's also something about just being in the woods by yourself too, right? Like hiking alone or going on a paddle or whatever it is you want to do. Someone who's coming for just a weekend getaway from the city and somebody who's been doing it for 20 years or more, they can see the same challenges. They could have the same things happen to them. So, I mean, they might be more prepared, but they can still get caught up in that same storm, right? Or they could still slip and fall or whatever it might be.
Whatever it was, by October 22nd, 1926, Brown's hometown newspaper reported that Volcanic Robert A. Brown was missing. Quote, the veteran prospector of the North Fork, 12 miles north of Grand Forks, who has been hunting for the hidden treasure in the Pitt Lake District for the past 3 summers, would appear to have become disabled during his stay this summer and was unable to make his way out himself. His non-arrival, about the time expected, caused the anxiety of old-time friends who got the provincial police to institute a search, and happily they located him. Doc Brown, as he is also known, left for the coast last spring on his annual pilgrimage to find what is usually called the hidden treasure, which is thought to be a rich gold streak located years ago by a prospector who later died, leaving only meager directions as to the location of the prospect. End quote. On October 18th, 1926, a dispatch from New Westminster appeared in the daily papers. Quote, rescued in the nick of time, Robert A. Brown, 70s, a prospector, known as Doctor, was found in his shack in the district north of the head of Pitt Lake. Mr. Brown was found in low condition. One of his feet was frozen. He had no matches, and his food was almost gone. He was given attention by his rescuers and is being brought out as rapidly as his condition permits. The aged prospector had intended to come out several weeks ago, and his non-appearance on the outside has led to the search for him. He has spent several winters in Vancouver. End quote. But wait, there's more. Much more. That same day, the British Columbian, out of New Westminster, published the gory details. Quote, 3 weeks spent in a shack on 7 Mile Creek, during which he amputated the small toe of his left foot with a hunting knife. Such was the experience of Doc R.A. Brown, a well-known prospector who was brought down from the Pitt Lake yesterday afternoon after having been reported lost more than a week ago. Although his left foot is badly frozen, Brown refused to go to the hospital and insisted on registering at the Holbrook Hotel, his hangout while in the city. End quote. It seems that Brown had been 40 miles north of Pitt Lake, and when he was halfway across Stave Glacier, a blizzard made it impossible to cross. The article mentions he slept through the storm, but woke up to find his left foot frozen. And quote, finding it impossible to cross the glacier, Brown traversed the edge of the ice plateau, making an average of 5 miles a day for 4 days. Brown finally reached the shack on 7 Mile Creek, where there were plenty of provisions, but he was more or less helpless. End quote. He was eventually rescued, but in case you missed it, Volcanic Brown cut off his own frostbitten toe in the middle of the bush. Don Froese says Brown was able to make that difficult decision because he knew what he was doing.
Indigenous people use yarrow to treat headaches, stings, cuts, sores, burns, nosebleeds, anesthetic. So that would have been a big deal for him. He was well-versed in spring tonics. So he would know that his immune system would have been optimum. And before you do any surgery like that, I mean, you can't have a fever or anything like that, right? Or a pre-existing infection. knowing how to apply pressure and then how to protect his foot. There's one photo of him wearing a boot with it looks like a piece of a bean can over the toes. Well, you don't cut your toes off unless you have a plan as to what happens when you cut them off. Like, what are you going to do with the stubbies, right? So he had to already have his medicine ready to go, and he lived through that.
Volcanic Brown, short one toe, but not short of nerve, did not immediately go back into the pit. Not immediately, but eventually. Brian Antonson says that the next time he went looking for Slumach's mine, he never made it out.
There were 2 searches for him. One was the first time after he'd gone out to help somebody. One was the second time when they were not successful in finding him. And that speaks to his work or his ethos or whatever, his mindset as a healer.
Or did it speak to something else? Something more nefarious, like the curse?
Well, I mean, it's an area of BC that is notorious for people basically going missing, in the sense that they go exploring and things go wrong.
Did rescuers find Slumach's gold in Brown's deserted campsite?
When his camp was found, it was as if he had left immediately. Everything was still there in place. It was left as if he just kind of disappeared.
And what about those poor, unfortunate souls who went looking for Slumach's lost gold mine and never came out?
Something happens, but what happens to them, sometimes it just is the mystery, when you don't find them and they don't come back.
That's next time on Dead Man's Curse, Volcanic Gold. Thank you for joining me, and special thanks to Don Froese, Brian Antonson, Marc Ferrero, and Renee Coghill for their work in this episode. Dead Man's Curse is hosted by myself, Kru Williams, and written by Ernest White II and Dila Velasquez. Our producers are Dila Velasquez and Jessica Young. Audio producers are Rosalind Kufor and Rob Johnston. Sound design by Rob Johnston. Our associate producer and Indigenous cultural and heritage consultant is Gail Starr. Our executive producers are Chris Duncombe, Ernest White II, Michael Francis, Kru Williams, Tim Hardy, and David Way. Dead Man's Curse is a production of Curious Cast, podcast for curious minds, and Great Pacific Media. For more information on this episode, follow us on social media, check out our website, and check out our show notes for additional information. We'll see you next time on Dead Man's Curse, Volcanic Gold.